Oh, nope. All right. Hello, welcome to this episode of the REBT Advocates with Dr. Michael R. Adelstein of 3minutetherapy.com. You can find this book co-authored with our current guest, 3-Minute Therapy, Change Your Thinking, Change Your Life at therebt.life. And me, Tommy Bateman, I'm a counselor, wonderful, wonderful counselor here at Richmond, Virginia. Today we have, as I mentioned, the co-author of 3-Minute Therapy, David Ramsay Steele, whose latest book, The Mystery of Fascism, is a wonderful read, his greatest hits, a collection of his essays. Michael, what are we talking about today?
Well, we're talking, as you mentioned, Tommy, we're talking to David Ramsay Steele, and David's written a number of books, including The Mystery of Fascism, his latest. David's also written Orwell, Your Orwell, Atheism Explained, and From Marx to Mises, all brilliant books. And also David and I wrote together Therapy Breakthrough, another brilliant book. And we will be discussing Freud. David, in Therapy Breakthrough, David wrote the sections on Freud, and we have David on because he's an expert on Freud. So my first question, David, is Albert Ellis used to say about Freud, he set back the cause of psychotherapy 50 years. What are your thoughts about that?
Oh, yes, at least 50 years. I think he's and psychology generally, I think he set back because I think William James had it than Freud did. And of course, Freud was extremely influential. I believe, I think it's been said by Frederick Crews, who is famous for being a Freud basher, and does very well at it, that in the 50s and early 60s, the head of every psychology department in a US college was a Freudian, and today none of them are, which shows you what has happened to Freudianism.
Yes, yes.
But it was extremely influential in the United States immediately after the Second World War.
I have a number of questions about what you just said, David. Why do you suppose he had this great influence, probably in all of Western civilization, when just about everything he claimed about psychoanalysis was fictional?
You broke up a bit in my hearing there, so I'm going to guess at what you said. Why was he so influential? I think part of the reason why Freud was tremendously influential was that he's a very brilliant, persuasive writer. He's a rhetorician of the first order. And I think that the two motivating forces of Freud's life were A, to become rich, and B, to become a famous writer. And he succeeded brilliantly in both of those objectives. So I think part of the reason is undoubtedly the persuasiveness of his prose.
Yeah. Now, would you agree with me, David, that some of Freud's ideas related to therapy, psychoanalysis, seem to have survived to this day in some psychotherapy practices? One is the unconscious. So what was Freud's idea of the unconscious, and how has it been revised by current therapists or used lock, stock, and barrel by current therapists?
Right. Again, part of what you said there was garbled in my ears, but I will try to guess what you said, which will probably be better than what you said anyway. I think that the very precise specifics of what Freud said are today held by very few people. I have yet to meet, at least in the past 30 years, anybody who believed in penis envy, for example. And even the Oedipus complex, I think, is very out of fashion. but I think certain very broad notions that Freud relied upon, like the idea that we don't really know what's motivating us and we can't easily find out. That what happened to us in our early childhood and our relationships with our parents is very decisive for the formation of our personalities. I think ideas like that are very, very popular. Now, I don't think they're universally held. I think there are people like you and me who reject them, and I think that kind of approach, which rejects those propositions, has got a good following. But there are still people who we can broadly call psychodynamic therapists who take for granted these propositions of Freud. So they take for granted that you can find out something by talking to people about their early relations with their parents. They take for granted that somebody may have a motivation that they're totally unaware of and can't easily become aware of. They take for granted that a person's dreams are tremendously significant as telling us something about that person's psychological makeup and problems and so on. So that very broad Freudianism, and it comes across in sometimes in quite specific ways. Like, for instance, if someone is very precise and conscientious and detail oriented, they will be described as anal. And that's the idea that if you have that kind of personality, it comes from your conflicts when you were being potty trained. That is a sort of Freudian idea. So even some of the specific things do survive.
Yeah. And it's my impression that almost all therapists, even cognitive behavior therapists, unfortunately, rely on the etiology of emotional disturbance as emanating from a person's childhood and throwing out the strong genetic influence. Tommy, did you have a question?
Not necessarily specifically, but we kind of talked about the pervasiveness of Freudian thought. It seems that a lot of what, as you mentioned, the anal example, and then we talk about unconscious thinking and things like that, that may be used not necessarily how Freud used them, but it's emanated throughout pop culture to a point where it's a second language, just like how the Bible influenced a lot of our literature, and it's good to know that literature in order to know the modern stuff or the newer writing, but it doesn't necessarily have the same gravity as it used to when it was first made up. Does that make sense to you? Or did I gargle? Am I gargled?
There are also ideas which Freud didn't advocate, but which sound a bit Freudian, and have a kind of Freudian style. One of those is that you can explain the motivation of men by their anxiety about their small penises. This is a very popular idea. I've read pretty much everything of Freud that's been translated into English, and I've never come across that in Freud. And I don't think it's the sort of thing he would have held anyway. Probably because he had a small penis.
Yeah, exactly.
But at any rate, it's not actually a Freudian idea, but it's very much a Freudian style idea. And people are extremely credulous. Once you accept the idea that you have motivations that you don't know about and can't easily find out about, then the sky's the limit. All kinds of incredible nonsense can become accepted and uncritically.
Another idea that I've heard credited to Freud, and David, you could correct this, is that the only true orgasm a woman could have is a vaginal orgasm. And if the orgasm comes from a different source, such as masturbating or oral sex, it's not a real, true, good orgasm. Have you heard that one?
I think that's right. That certainly, I can't recall a passage where Freud actually says anything like that, but I think he did in fact share. It was a common prejudice of the time that a woman wasn't fully mature until she could have a vaginal orgasm instead of a clitoral orgasm. And I think Freud accepted that. And what is certainly true of Freud, and it is very explicit, is that he viewed all oral sex and all homosexuality as being pathological.
Although Freud wasn't a surgeon, wasn't he party to some gruesome surgeries on at least one woman's nose in an effort to help her with her emotional problem?
Right. He collaborated with various people who were like partners of his, and I think that was in the period when he was collaborating with Wilhelm Fliess. Wilhelm Fliess, I think, was the one who thought that all sexual problems, which meant all neurotic problems, could be treated by operating on the nose. There's a famous case of a woman patient who Fliess operated on her nose and nearly killed her, and left a huge length of gauze in her nose, and she had to be operated on again to save her life. And this is Freud before the invention of psychoanalysis in its finished form. And so it's an early Freudian escapade. But yes, he was associated. And also, of course, if we're talking about Freud's recklessness and irresponsibility, he was a very assiduous promoter of the virtues of cocaine, which was a comparatively new wonder drug, which in the early days people said there was absolutely no addiction and it was a cure for all kinds of problems. So Freud was very definitely a long, serious cocaine user himself, and recommended it to his fiancée and his friends, and in print recommended it. Later, he sort of cautiously backed away from advocacy of cocaine when its reputation began to suffer.
Yeah. David, you mentioned one of the problems with psychoanalysis is the idea that a person's emotional problems as an adult comes from their childhood upbringing. So if that's wrong, what is, in your estimation, the cause of emotional problems in adults?
Oh, that's a big question. I would say that part of the reason that there is individual variation in the way people's minds develop, let's put it that way, would be genetic. That different people are genetically predisposed to different ways of thinking, and therefore they're genetically predisposed to kinds of behavior and thinking that correlates with that. So I would say that genetics is an important. If someone is extremely shy, as I am by nature, I would say that that's largely genetic. Other people don't seem to be afflicted at all by shyness, don't have public speaking anxiety and that sort of thing. They can't even comprehend it. And I would say that's basically probably overwhelmingly a genetic difference. Then I think there can be accidents of the way a person's belief system develops, which have far-reaching implications. They may learn, for example, that if they keep on failing, it shows they're an utter failure and they're doomed to fail. That doesn't necessarily start with their parents, and they must have some genetic predisposition to accept that sort of idea. But there are sort of events in someone's life that can affect that.
Yeah, so in other words, people's genetic predispositions could hook onto childhood experiences, such as the overgeneralizing, which is a human tendency, and then someone fails a number of times as a child, and then they overgeneralize to their future and to their total self. Would you agree with that explanation?
Yes. I mean, I'm suspicious of the use of the term overgeneralization in a negative sense, because I think that everybody has an instinct to generalize beyond what the data suggests. And I think that we have to have that. I think it's essential that we have that tendency. And science would never have developed if people didn't have that tendency. Of course, it should be married with some awareness that this generalization needs to be tested from time to time to consider that it might possibly be faulty in some way. But yes, I certainly think that's true.
Yeah, I think that's a good clarification. So to put it another way, we all have a genetic predisposition to escalate our strong preferences into demands: must, shoulds, have to, supposed tos. So if I have a strong preference to get my mother's approval, it's easy for me, being a human, to convince myself, because I strongly prefer to have my mother's approval, I absolutely must have her approval. And since she's a woman, therefore I absolutely must have the approval of all women. Does that chain of reasoning make sense?
Yes, makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And in terms of, Tommy and I are REBT therapists. So are there any recommendations you have for us in doing REBT, rational emotive behavior therapy, to be aware of these biases, these psychoanalytic biases that people still have or find in the culture, to be particularly helpful, more so than perhaps other CBT therapists who aren't aware of these perversions?
Well, I think you have told me, Michael, and I believe you, that the broadly Freudian or psychodynamic way of thinking is much less common than it used to be among your clients. And so maybe it's becoming less and less necessary. But I certainly encounter people who do come out with these Freudian things as though they're obvious. I also encounter people who should know. I mean, there are people who call themselves cognitive behavioral therapists, who, when you scratch them, they start talking in Freudian terms. And a good example, of course, is Jordan Peterson, who, while he appears to be quite negative about Freud, he calls himself a cognitive behavioral therapist. He says that's what he does. But at the same time, he says that Freud made great discoveries, and we now think he's pretty negative about Freud. He says that Freud made a lot of mistakes, and unfortunately, we only remember him for his mistakes. Well, when I look at Freud, I don't see anything except mistakes, really. But Peterson is far less skeptical about Jung than he is about Freud, and there's all kinds of Jungian things that like the basically stories that we tell ourselves, symbols and religious metaphors and so on. This is part of the way in which Peterson, who is obviously an atheist, avoids admitting that he's an atheist, because he thinks there are truths in religion, and especially in theistic religion, which come from these Jungian archetypes in our brains. So Peterson is one example of a quite a common phenomenon of someone who says, "Oh yes, I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist," and then you talk to them and you find them suddenly saying, "Oh, that people think that way because they unconsciously want to think that way." They'll suddenly start coming out with that kind of reasoning, and you realize that that they haven't fully absorbed the lessons of the cognitive behavioral revolution.
Yes, yes. A notable one is Jeffrey Young, who pioneered what he called, I think it's called solution-focused cognitive behavior therapy. And he takes his clients, last I heard from him that he takes his clients back to their childhood to find out where their problems emanated from. Okay, we just have another minute or two. Any other questions, Tommy, that you had for David?
No, not off the top of my head. I do have to mention the Jordan Peterson thing is funny. Mostly, I'm glad he went ahead and said he's definitely not a Christian, because even though he claims to be it sometimes, because when he's asked, hey, do you believe in God? He goes, what do you mean by God? And it depends on what God means. Like, what? No Christian would, oh yeah, I do believe in God. That's it. I mean, anyway, sorry. But secondly, no, this has been a great conversation. I wish we could talk about a myriad of topics, psychology and not psychology related. So I really enjoyed listening. That's why I didn't talk much. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Tommy. And I just want to mention while we're on Jordan Peterson that Tommy and I have 2 earlier episodes where we are very happy to criticize Jordan Peterson. And one of the things we mentioned, David, is what you mentioned. He calls himself a cognitive behavior therapist. Then he goes ahead and discusses the value of Freud and especially Jung. So you might want to watch those 2 episodes.
Yes,
They're
yes.
2 of our most popular episodes. Any last things you'd like to say, David, about Freud, your work, or how people can find out more about you?
Oh, well, you can look me up on Amazon and look at the books I've written. They're all pretty interesting books. Certainly, I never tire of reading them. I can't put them down sometimes.
Right.
So I've written on a lot of things, mostly having nothing to do with Freud. And in my book on George Orwell, for example, I don't think I mentioned Freud. I'll leave it there, I think.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us, David. And if you go to YouTube and put and search on David Ramsay Steele, you'll see interviews that other people have done with David on some of these other books. Okay, I'm Dr. Michael Edelstein, clinical psychologist. These days, my practice is all remote. So please contact me at 3minutetherapy.com if you have further questions about that. And thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a like. And in the comments section, if you have further questions or subjects you'd like Tommy and I to explore, add that. And if you'd like to come on and discuss a personal problem, Tommy and I will be happy to cure you in a few minutes. Or if you're a therapist and you'd like supervision on one of our episodes, we're happy to do that. We've supervised some therapists on these episodes. Please subscribe to the RBT Advocates, and to stay on the rational side of life, listen to our videos. Bye now.